This is HIS 121 Test 1 Review, Part 3, and we will deal with Chapters 5 and 6. Question number 31. Identify the following: Pontiac's Rebellion, the Paxton Boys, and the Proclamation of 1763, and all of these are related. First, Pontiac's Rebellion refers to an organized effort by a group of American Indians under an Ottawa chief named Pontiac, who brought in Indians from other tribes, including the Shawnees and the Senecas and the Kickapoos, the Miamis, the Delawares, several different tribes that formed together to attack British forts in the American colonies and American settlements on the western frontier. So when we're talking about the western frontier, to give you an idea what that looked like in the 1760s, that would include Detroit, Michigan. Fort Detroit was, Michigan did not exist at that time, but Fort Detroit was in modern day Detroit, and it was besieged by this group of Indians. They also led attacks on other forts and other settlements. They ended up in a 3-year period killing about 500 British and colonial soldiers and about 500 settlers, colonists. Virginia lost about 100 colonists in areas that would now be modern-day West Virginia, the Greenbrier area, and also in the Covington, Allegheny area due to attacks by Pontiac. So Pontiac's Rebellion refers to this series of attacks led by Chief Pontiac on British forts and American settlements on the frontier late in the French and Indian War, and then all the way really from 1763 to 1766. The second term, Paxton Boys, is heavily connected to Pontiac's Rebellion. The Paxton Boys were a group of Pennsylvania settlers on the western frontier who were angry about the Indian attacks there. They did not believe they were getting the protection and support from the Pennsylvania legislature, which was back to the east in Philadelphia. And so in that way, this is similar to what happened years earlier with Bacon's Rebellion. But anyhow, the Paxton Boys was a group of Scots-Irish settlers who attacked a group of peaceful American Indians. They were known as praying Indians because they had converted to Christianity. They had taken on English names. They were part of a small tribe called the Conestoga Indians, also known as the Susquehannocks, and essentially they were just murdered and slaughtered by this group of settlers called the Paxton Boys. They even went after a couple more who had not been present in their initial attack on the settlement, but thankfully they were unable to reach them. But there was an older couple, so essentially this group of Indians died out because of the Paxton Boys. And again, the Conestogas had absolutely nothing to do with Pontiac's Rebellion, but that did not prevent the Paxton Boys from carrying out this murderous attack. They were never prosecuted for their actions, though several of those who were alleged to be involved were in fact killed later by American Indians during the American Revolution. The Proclamation of 1763 is also connected to the other two terms, because the Proclamation of 1763 was an edict or decree from the British government that American colonists could not go past a certain point in the Appalachian Mountains. They could not settle beyond that point. This angered the colonists significantly, because one of the reasons they were willing to fight alongside the British against the French during the French and Indian War had been because this competition for land in the Ohio River Valley. Now the British were saying that once the war was over, that Americans could not settle beyond that boundary because of British concerns about these Indian attacks, and that really upset the Americans. They felt that the whole reason they had fought the war was basically nullified by this legislation from the British. Question number 32, what was the Stamp Act and why did the British implement it? The Stamp Act was an effort by the British government to recover costs from their expenditures in the French and Indian War. At the conclusion of that war, they had a horrible national debt. I had mentioned that it was a world war for the British. They not only fought in North America, but they fought against the French in other parts of the world as well. And the debt that they had incurred was significant. And so the British needed to raise revenue. From the British perspective, it made perfect sense that since they had expended a lot of money protecting the colonies in North America, that the colonists would also have to pay their fair share. So they implemented this stamp tax. However, the problem was that it was the first direct tax on the colonists, and they were very angry about it. From the colonists' perspective, they did not have an elected representative in Parliament in England, so it didn't make sense that they would have to pay a tax that they could not voice their opinion on. The British had other folks around the world, other colonists, pay taxes, but that had not happened in America, and the Americans were very angry about it. Who led the protests against it in Virginia? That would be Patrick Henry. In the Virginia General Assembly, he gave a long speech talking about the potential dangers of taxation, and that his opposition, the opposition in Virginia, spread throughout the colonies. And in some places, especially in New England, some of that opposition was actually quite violent. The most effective way, though, that the Americans responded to the Stamp Act was to stop purchasing, to a great degree, British products. And when British merchants realized the struggles they were having economically because the colonists were not buying as many products, they put pressure on the Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. So the Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but in doing so, they issued something called the Declaratory Act, which basically was a statement by the British Parliament that they had the authority and the ability to issue any laws applying to the colonies that they felt were necessary, that it was their right to legislate against the colonies, including whether it involved taxes or not. So they gave in to the colonists, but at the same time asserted their authority to actually have those pieces of legislation that impacted the colonists. So the next question is number 33. What was the Boston Massacre? The Boston Massacre was a confrontation between British soldiers and citizens in Boston that resulted from really angry words, things being thrown at the British soldiers. Following the Stamp Act debacle, more and more soldiers had moved into Boston, and as a result there was a lot of tensions between the British soldiers and the Boston citizens. This led into this confrontation, which ultimately resulted in the several British soldiers firing on colonists, killing a number of colonists, and this was publicized as the Boston Massacre. From a legal perspective, what ends up happening is John Adams, who later becomes a great patriot and President of the United States, represented the British soldiers who were indicted in that incident, and they were actually acquitted of any wrongdoing. But from a public relations standpoint, a publicity standpoint, the Boston Massacre made the British soldiers look very hostile to American interests. Number 34, what were the committees of correspondence? Samuel Adams, the cousin of John Adams, actually started this organization in Boston, and they started exchanging information with other colonists in different parts of the American colonies about things that are occurring, interactions that are happening between the colonists and the British government, and discussing issues of oppression or the subjugation of the liberties of the colonists by the British military in different parts of the country and by the British government. And this led to an organized network where the colonists could tell what was going on in other parts of the American colonies and how colonists were responding. So there were committees of correspondence in Boston, there were committees of correspondence here in Virginia and in other colonies, and again, this created this network where they could share information and help determine the appropriate responses to actions taken by the British government. Number 35, what led to the Boston Tea Party? The Boston Tea Party occurred as a response to British legislation about tea. And what happened is the Parliament had passed the Tea Act of 1773, and the reason for it was not to do anything to punish the colonists, but rather to provide more economic benefit to the East India Company, a British tea firm, so that they could be more efficient in how they made money. Because the fact is, there were a lot of American colonists involved in smuggling tea. And so the response was to this monopoly. And again, a monopoly can be dangerous because it allows one company to control a certain business that can allow that company to increase prices. In this case, prices actually went down, but that didn't matter to the colonists. The idea of the monopoly was problematic. And again, a lot of the leading patriots were also involved in smuggling efforts, and they knew this would be a crackdown on the smuggling efforts. So what occurred in response to this is that we have in 1773 a group of colonists, again in Boston, who occupy a ship that had tea in the Boston harbor, and their response is to basically, while disguised as American Indians, though the British knew this was not Indians carrying this out, that this was definitely these colonist members of a group called the Sons of Liberty. They threw several hundred chests of tea into the Boston harbor in protest of this East India monopoly, and that was the Boston Tea Party. That happened in November of 1773. The response of Parliament in Britain was very stern. They passed a series of legislative acts that basically impacted the liberties of the people in Boston. They closed Boston Harbor. They did several other things, and these pieces of legislation became known as the Coercive Acts in Britain, but in the colonies they were called the Intolerable Acts. So the second part of that question, what was the legislative response of Parliament to the Tea Party? That was the Coercive Acts, or also known as the Intolerable Acts to American colonists. Some pieces of legislation got attached to that, even though it wasn't really part of that. For example, the Quebec Act was a piece of legislation where the British Parliament said that Quebec, which the British had taken over after the French and Indian War in Canada, that it was overwhelmingly Catholic, that the French living there could maintain their Catholic faith. That was another thing that did not go over well because there was a lot of anti-Catholicism in the American colonists. So they looked at it as the British government protecting the French who lived in Canada, but not protecting the interests of the American colonists. So that was the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts. That was the legislative response to the Boston Tea Party. Now we're going to scroll down to the questions that are in chapter 6. So number 36, where were the first battles of the American Revolution fought? They were actually fought in Massachusetts at two places called Lexington and Concord. Lexington had a facility or an ammunition depot essentially for local colonists. The British government decided to seize those weapons, and this is on the heels of increased tension following the Boston Tea Party, following those coercive acts. And so what happens is they actually have their first armed conflict there on the green in Lexington, Massachusetts. A few Americans were killed. They were known as the Minutemen because they were able to come together in a minute. You may have heard, of course, of the famous Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. There were actually some other folks, not just Paul Revere, who basically warned the colonists that the British were coming. So they gathered together this militia very quickly of Minutemen to meet the British soldiers at the Lexington Green. Someone fired a shot. We don't know exactly who. That was known as a shot heard round the world because it started this American Revolution, which would have a huge impact on world history. But anyway, Lexington and Concord, both in Massachusetts, would be the first two skirmishes, the first battles of the American Revolution. Again, this happened in April of 1775 in Massachusetts. Number 37, distinguish between the Patriots and the Loyalists. Despite the fact that now the British and Americans had been involved in armed conflict, that does not mean that all the colonists, by any stretch of imagination, were united behind this idea of seeking independence from the British. In fact, really, independence is something that comes kind of slowly. We'll talk about that in question number 40. There were some who just thought this was a minor period of conflict between the British and the colonists, that things would be resolved. But as time goes on, that becomes apparent that's not the case. Those Americans who decide that they support the notion of independence, that they decide America should be separate and free from the British government, those individuals were known as patriots. The American colonists who wanted to remain as part of Britain and were loyal to the crown were known as the loyalists. And the fact is, in America, there was not a majority in either group, and it certainly varied from geographic area to area as whether or not you had a large segment of the population who were patriot and a large segment of the population who were loyalists. But those who supported American independence were known as the patriots. Those who were opposed to American independence and wanted to remain loyal to the British crown were called loyalists. Question number 38. What was Dunmore's Proclamation? That is named after the royal governor of Virginia, who in 1775 issued a decree promising freedom to any enslaved people or indentured servants who remained loyal to the king. That is, if they were enslaved by patriots. Otherwise, they would still remain in slavery. But the Dunmore's Proclamation basically was an incentive to slaves to rise up to fight against their masters who were patriots, because this was a path to freedom for those slaves who would join in and fight with the British against the patriots. That's Dunmore's Proclamation. It did not have a significant impact. There was not a large number of slaves, though there were some who did fight for the British, but it scared the patriots who, especially in the areas where they were slave owners, that there might be a number of slave revolts, and therefore this angered a lot of Virginians and others in the region. Dunmore ends up leaving Virginia in 1776, basically driven away by patriots. Number 39, identify the following. So here's a number of individuals who had an important role in the American Revolution. The first is George Washington. George Washington, of course, known as the father of the country. He had fought in the French and Indian War. Of course, alongside the British, he had led a Virginia militia that was involved in some of the early fighting that led to this war. So he had some military experience, but he becomes a great leader, not because of his military expertise. He made some significant blunders during the American Revolution, but because really he had the characteristics to keep his men together and keep the American war effort going, which was really remarkable because there were a lot of obstacles that the American military faced. He was appointed as the leader of the First Continental Army, and he does a great job again, not because of his military intelligence, but because of his character. He was sort of a force of nature as a leader. He was not the best military leader, but he was America's best leader. He wasn't a great military strategist, but he was a great leader, and then of course later on will become the first president of the United States. Thomas Paine was actually from Britain, had not lived in America very long, but in 1776 he published a pamphlet that became one of the most read instruments throughout the colonies, called Common Sense. And in this pamphlet, Thomas Paine argues that there's no reason for the American colonies to remain loyal to Britain, that it will only cause problems for them later on, that because the American colonies had the potential to be this great juggernaut. They had all this land, they had more and more people coming into this area, and being aligned with the British would only drag them down and cause them to be involved in wars like the French and Indian War that really did not benefit the colonists themselves. Because of that, that helped push or increase support for independence in 1776, when initially that was not given a lot of thought by people, that the colonies would actually break away and start their own country. But Thomas Paine definitely was an advocate for that. Thomas Jefferson was governor of Virginia during the American Revolution for a time period, but before that, and much more significantly, Jefferson became important because he was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. He was not the only author. In fact, when he himself had a lot of help from both Ben Franklin and John Adams in drafting the document, and yet he was asked to modify it by the Continental Congress, but he was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, which of course is ratified by the Continental Congress and takes effect on July 4th, 1776, and that's why we, of course, celebrate that day still here in America. Patrick Henry actually mentioned previously as the individual who led the Virginia response to the Stamp Act. He also, on the eve of the Revolution, gave a very famous speech in the Virginia General Assembly, or Virginia House of Burgesses, where he argued that he would, the choice was between liberty or death. He says, "Give me liberty, and if I don't have liberty, give me death." So, "Give me liberty or give me death," a very famous speech. Patrick Henry, a great patriot in the American Revolution. Number 40, what factors led to the push for American independence rather than reconciliation? I've talked about one of those. The publishing of Common Sense really made a lot of American colonists think differently about the idea of independence. A couple of other things happened as well, though, during the 1776 that really pushed Americans towards independence. One of the things that happened was the British had actually burned some American cities. Now, it's questionable whether the British were responsible themselves or some of that occurred because of the colonists, but it was used from a publicity standpoint. One of the cities was Norfolk, Virginia, that was burned. Another was in Maine. And so these were cities that the fact that these cities were destroyed really made people think that there was no turning back in our conflict with the British, that we could not be reconciled with the British. Another factor was the fact that the British used German mercenaries, Hessian mercenaries from the German state of Hessen. Mercenaries are soldiers essentially who are paid to fight. The Germans had no dog in this fight, so to speak, but they were paid by the British government to come and fight against the colonists, and they were perceived as barbarians by many colonists. But this act, this use of mercenaries, was considered barbaric. How could the British government do that? How could we reconcile with people who are willing to pay soldiers to come in and to kill colonists? Fact is, the Hessians were probably not very different from other soldiers. They certainly were no more barbaric than some of the things that happen normally within wars. In fact, a lot of the Hessians at the conclusion of the American Revolution ended up settling in America and marrying American colonists and becoming part of this new country that emerges. Number 41, what October 1777 battle was considered the turning point of the American Revolution? That would be the Battle of Saratoga that was fought in upstate New York. And the hero of that battle was a guy named Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold, who would become known later on as a famous traitor because he tried to deliver the fort at West Point to the British government. He got frustrated. He did not feel like he was being recognized for all his efforts, and he ends up basically betraying the American country to support the British. Washington goes after him. They try to seize him. He ends up moving to Canada and then to overseas to try to escape, but he becomes known as this incredibly infamous traitor. But before that, though, he was really one of the heroes of the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. Though badly wounded, he led a significant charge against the British. And really, the British sort of mismanaged that whole military campaign, and it allowed the Americans to take advantage of that. And the reason that the Battle of Saratoga is considered the turning point of the American Revolution is it was one of the factors that convinced the French that the French could help, that the Americans could win the war, and therefore the French should join in this conflict. The French did not want to support a group of people who were going to lose to the British. But once the Americans won Saratoga, France becomes convinced that the Americans can win the war, and in turn the French end up supplying about half of our regular military and about 2/3 of the Navy that the Americans used from that point forward, and the American Revolution is comprised of French ships. So it's questionable whether the Americans could actually have won the Revolution without the help of the French, but following that battle they got significant assistance from the French. Number 42, what happened at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777-1778? Valley Forge was just an encampment outside of Philadelphia by the American soldiers, the Continental Army. Washington's men were encamped at Valley Forge. The reason it's significant because it's not a battle. It's significant because so many Americans died from horrible conditions. The winter was terrible, and a lot of American soldiers died from either starvation or from freezing to death, or because they were so susceptible to illness as they lost weight in these cold conditions. Many of them died. Number 43, who was Nathaniel Greene? Nathaniel Greene was a New Englander who came down from Massachusetts and became really the American Revolutionary hero of the South. He led the forces in the South, and even though he lost some battles in the South, he really caused a lot of damage to the British military, perhaps most famously at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which is located, not coincidentally, in the city now known as Greensboro. They did drop the E, but Greensboro is named after Nathaniel Greene. The British technically won the battle. The Americans retreated, but they inflicted enough damage that it really impacted General Cornwallis's plans. He had to chase Greene, chase him through Halifax County, here in Virginia, through other parts of southeastern Virginia towards the peninsula, and that's going to allow the second part of that question. What happened at the Battle of Yorktown? Cornwallis's large group of British soldiers were surrounded. They got caught on this peninsula at Yorktown. The French Navy made it to the James River before the British Navy could. George Washington had soldiers come in, and so there were French soldiers, American soldiers, and then the French Navy surrounded this large contingent of British troops at Yorktown. Cornwallis had no choice in 1781 but to surrender, and that was the last major conflict of the American Revolution. At that point, the war was essentially over. Now, getting to question number 44, the treaty that ended the American Revolution was the Treaty of Paris, which was signed by the British and the Americans in 1783. The French and their Spanish allies were hesitant to support it because the French had worked hard to try to get more for Spain. Spain had provided some ancillary support to the Americans during the war, not a lot of military support directly, but they had provided, they did attack British shipping in the Caribbean. They did interfere with British efforts down there that basically distracted the British, that prevented the British from bringing more of their naval vessels from the Caribbean into the Battle of the American Revolution. But they had not put in the effort like the French had, and essentially the French were trying to get as much as they could for the Spanish. The Americans didn't go along with that, and essentially the French either had to go along with this treaty or they recognized that there could be some type of reconciliation or union between the Americans and British. They were going to be separate politically. We now had a new independent country in America, but they were still concerned about an alliance between the Americans and the British, because that would have been problematic for the French with those two nations joining together. So even though the French had supported the American colonists, they didn't necessarily agree with everything in the Treaty of Paris, but they did go ahead and sign it because they wanted to remain in good relations with the American colonists. Of course, only 4 years later, 6 years later, the French Revolution, which would kind of create other issues for America between the French and British, and would also upend that French-American alliance. Number 45, what was the Confiscation Acts? That's what happened to this law. Basically allowed governments to confiscate or take property from those American colonists who remain loyal to the British. Basically, it's what happens if you support the losing side. And it was harsh, but American colonists who remain loyal to the British end up being punished by having their property seized by American colonists. Okay, that's the end of Part 3 and the end of the test review for U.S. History HIS 121 Test 1.